Just gotta breathe. Cow. I gotta go, Julia. We got cows. Another cow.
Actually, I think that was the same one.
I love how nonchalantly Helen Hunt goes, cow, and then cow, as it goes back around. I feel bad for the cow, man. It, like, went past them, and then it went past them again. That cow's probably dead. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Cinema Psych Podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and in this one, we're going to go take a trip down memory lane, but with a new movie. That's right. We are going to explore the 1996 film Twister and its 2024 sequel, spiritual sequel, I will say, because it's not actually a real sequel. It's just in name only, as well as the natural disasters, I suppose. But Twisters, which did come out in the same year as this episode is being recorded. So let me give you some background of the two films, just in case you haven't seen either one. They are both tornado disaster movies. And I gotta say, Twister came out in 1996, and honestly, at the height of the disaster movie craze, like, we had earthquakes, we had volcanoes. I mean, there was a year, I think it was 1995, where it was two volcano movies in a single year. Quite the craze in the 90s for natural disaster films. And the decade got capped off by two asteroid / comet, large heavenly bodies coming to kill us in our lovely little pale blue dot. So quite the fascination in the decade. And of course, revisiting tornadoes is always good fun, I suppose. You just got to make them bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's funny because there is no number larger than an EF5 tornado. It's like EF5 plus, right? Anyways, the film Twister came out in 1996, starring Helen Hunt in one of her first big screen roles. She was already well known in the United States at this point because of her popular sitcom with Paul Reiser, Mad About You, one of my favorite 1990s comedies. I for some reason, I really enjoyed the dynamic between Helen Hunt and Paul Reiser, but, I was like 8, 10, whatever. Weird. Yes, I am a strange person. We all know this. The film also stars Bill Paxton and Jamie Gertz, Carrie Elwes, Philip Seymour Hoffman, in one of my favorite roles of his. He's not a main character in this movie, but he is certainly the main character in my heart. Alan Ruck, Sean Whalen, Scott Thompson, Todd Field, Joey Slotnick, Jeremy Davies. So many great people in this movie. And we can't forget the great Lois Smith as well. So, quite the film, directed by Jan de Bont. I was reading about the trivia on this movie, and boy, oh boy, was there some drama. I'm not going to be able to get into all of the drama here because we have loads to talk about in this episode. But needless to say, Steven Spielberg had to go to, because it was produced by Amblin Entertainment, had to go to set one day and just chew out Jan for the craziness. 2 different cinematography crews. Eventually, Jan ended up becoming his own cinematographer toward the end of cinematography. The writers of this, you will recognize one of the writers. Michael Crichton actually wrote the screenplay for this film with Anne-Marie Martin, which I think is amazing, to be honest with you. And probably the reason why executive producers like Steven Spielberg were like, yeah, sure, let's do this. Let's do this. Because the film also used some new technology in creating the titular natural disaster, the twisters, in this film. New computer technology created the twisters. Of course, they used wind machines on set to, like, you know, blow the hair of Helen Hunt or whatever. But all of the twisters, all of the tornadoes in the movie were created using computer graphics imagery, right? CGI. It's pretty cool. Pretty cool. Definitely dated. I watched it last night to this recording, and definitely dated, especially the water spouts in the river that are called sisters in this movie. And I'm really bummed that they changed it to twins in this follow-up. Speaking of the follow-up, let's talk about the spiritual sequel here. Again, not the same story, none of the same characters in it. And when I saw Twisters earlier this year in like August or whatever, I thought to myself, wait a minute, was that person in the original one? It turns out no. Anyways, so Twisters, which would have been great if they called the twins sisters, because it's just Twisted Sisters just there. It is just there for the low-hanging fruit ripening taking. Like, it's there. I don't know why they didn't do that. Anyways, this film stars Helen Hunt. No, just kidding. Daisy Edgar Jones as Kate in, I want to say, the exact same typecasting, because she has long, flowing, dirty blonde hair, just like Helen Hunt did. Okay. Glenn Powell steals everyone's heart in this movie. He's a storm chaser extraordinaire, streamer. You got to update it for the new millennium, you know, the 30-ish, almost 30 years that have been in between these two films, right? They're not just storm chasers, they're storm chasers with internet clout, right? Anthony Ramos plays Javi. Brandon Perea, Moira Tierney. She was the one who I thought, wow, was she in the first one? She was not. She plays Kathy, Kate, Daisy Edgar Jones' mom. We've got a few other names that you might be familiar with. David Corenswet. He is the new Superman, if you've been following along. Or he will be the new Superman, I suppose, filming right here, right? And in a tragedy of wasted potential, Paul Scheer is at the end of this movie playing an airport traffic cop who keeps asking Glenn Powell's character to move his car or truck. And the absolute wasted potential of Paul Scheer is monumental in this movie. I have to tell you that this second film, in my opinion, is definitely not as good as the original Twister. And we're going to get into this, I think, in this episode. We're going to get into the comparisons between the two and why these spiritual sequels or even regular sequels keep popping up many years later. Not in the normal 2 to 3 year gap in between, but like far more. And it's interesting, right? Trying to capture that magic. The film Twisters was directed by Lee Isaac Chung and written by Mark L. Smith, Joseph Kaczynski, and posthumous credit given to Michael Crichton. And I think the reason why credit is given to Michael Crichton posthumously here is that it's pretty much the same story. And I think that would be, plagiarism. Just go out and say it. It'd probably be pretty plagiaristic for Mark Smith and Joseph Kosinski to not give credit to Michael Crichton on this. Well, obviously the producers of the film too, right? So those are the two films in a nutshell. We're going to get into this, but just to give you a basic idea of both plots, because like I said, they're essentially the same story. We have our main character, who is a storm chaser, knows a lot about tornadoes, is from Oklahoma, suffers a tragedy with a tornado in their lives. Joe as a kid, Kate as a young college student, and they both deal with their trauma in different ways. We'll talk a little bit more about this as well in this episode, how they cope with their trauma, how they deal with their trauma, what they end up doing with this trauma. But then there is another character. In the first film, it's represented by Bill Paxton, and in this new film is represented by Glenn Powell's character Tyler. Tyler and Joe have a group of storm chasers. They go out, and apparently there's an outbreak of storms, volatile activity in the weather during a specific summer, which is causing a large amount of tornadoes to form. And there are reasons for wanting to capture as much data as possible. Joe and her team want to send out Dorothy, so named because of the Wizard of Oz, want to send out Dorothy to capture as much information inside a tornado to get a better prediction. And in the 2024 movie, they were trying to develop a new way to dissipate a tornado, right? Send chemicals into the tornado to completely disrupt the vortex and the spin and have it dissipate completely, which would prevent needless tragedy and disaster, right? So those are the MacGuffins of the movie, right? The inciting reasons. There's a lot of exposition about how tornadoes and storms work, and the audience is portrayed in the first movie by Jamie Gertz, who is Bill's new fiance. She is completely uneducated about weather and, interestingly, does not know anything that her fiance does. He's a weatherman, and she has no idea about anything he does. And in the sequel, we are, as the audience, in the role of a journalist who is following Tyler's streaming storm chaser crew, who also has no idea about tornadoes because he's British. That's why. So he's non-familiar with tornadoes because apparently he doesn't own a television or does not go on the internet to hear about tornadoes. Interestingly, still wants to write a story about online storm chasers. We'll see. Anyways, disasters happen. People almost die. Some people do die. And we don't have enough time to mourn them or move on. And we just quickly move on. And then we're like, oh my gosh, the end of the movie. They're in love with each other. Yay. You can see how much I did not like the second one. And rewatching the first one, some of its luster did fall for me. I will say that. But we'll go into more detail as we jump into this episode. So let's do that. Let's twist on in. My guest host today is returning guest host, Dr. Anthony Zoccolillo. He is a senior professional professor at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi, Texas. Welcome back to the show, Anthony.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's good to be back.
How has life been since we last chatted? It's been a while. June 2022 was when you were last on the show. So it's been like 2.5 years.
Well, you've got a nice rotating stable of guest hosts with a variety of different areas of expertise.
Very true.
So it is only fitting that our times together space out a little bit more. And actually, yeah, the last time we talked was June 2022, but I think it aired July 4th, hence the movie selection. So
yeah. And in case listener, you're wondering about that, that is episode 49, where we discussed Born on the 4th of July. And I think I specifically had Anthony on because he had suggested this movie, and I was like, well, it's going to go out on the 4th of July, so let's do it on purpose.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, we did.
So how was your semester?
It's crazy. We didn't get a chance to talk much, but ever since the birth, finger quotes, birth of AI in academia,
Sure.
It has really been quite strenuous in a way that emerging technologies has always been something that I've used as a challenge, and this is one that I have really had a hard time getting in front of.
Yeah, absolutely. And this semester specifically.
Yeah. Whenever it was that it was like the death knell to higher ed, and it was kind of a slow roll. There were always people who were using it, but they were pretty easy to weed out. And it seems like this semester they all took a crash course in how to use AI in their college classes, because they've gotten very, very creative. And a lot of my energy has been, AI proofing my content, which is impossible. Spinning our wheels, doing what we do. But it's the end of the semester, so we get our little break now, which is nice.
Yeah. And solidarity from me. I hear everything you're saying, and I think it's maybe not as much of a comfort to hear that other people are also struggling with it in other parts of the country, right? You're in Texas, I'm in Illinois. So, there is that small bit of comfort, I suppose, in that it's not just me, or it's not just you, or whatever. But yeah, it is going to be a challenge from here on out. And I'm sure we can thank academic dishonesty TikTok, right?
Yeah, among others.
Right.
Sure.
So, it's just two professors having a little bit of having a mini vent sesh, right?
Sure. The shared misery is at least a little bit of comfort, but it doesn't matter how many people I talk to. We're all sort of struggling with the same ideas of just when you figure you get out ahead of it, game changes a little bit. Yeah. So,
and I hesitate to tell you this, as well as the listeners who are listening to this. Apparently, independent testers out there, specifically for OpenAI's ChatGPT and its models, has been doing some funky stuff that reflect some outside thinking. So,
great.
Oh boy. I would say the next 5 years are going to be quite interesting. What that means for higher ed, I don't know. I kind of want to that's why I kind of like teaching research methods and statistics. It's quite difficult to fool someone who's got so much experience in just research methods and statistics. Sure, the writing is going to be a struggle to assess and evaluate, but I gotta say, you can't get in the way of trusty basic methods, basic stats output.
Great.
So
yep, I agree.
What do you see?
Already has a nice structure. Moisture levels are just right and lots of cape.
What else are you seeing?
Flow is clean, pulling tons of warm, moist air from the south.
And when that warm air and moisture busts through the cap, it explodes in the atmosphere, creating an anvil. The vertical wind shear begins to rotate the updraft, forming a mesocyclone.
And here's the mystery.
We don't know how a tornado forms. We see the hook on the radar, but
What are all the invisible factors coming together? Every little detail that
it has to be perfect. And it's a mix of what we know and everything we can't understand. It's part science, part religion. Come on, baby. Come on. Come on, please. Come on. Please. Come on.
There it is. Yeah, baby!
There we go.
You see that? That's a tornado right there, baby. Get some photos of that, man.
All right. So let's instead of artificial disasters, let's talk about natural disasters, shall we?
Sure.
Twister and Twisters. So I wanted to have you back on, and I asked you for your suggestions on this, and you came up with an interesting angle. So why are we talking about two films that are ostensibly about the same kind of natural disaster, tornadoes, and almost 30 years apart?
Sure. Yeah, no, the original idea was steeped in this idea of nostalgia.
Yeah.
So there were really two reasons why this appealed to me. The first, as you said, right, two sequels, Twisters coming out in the summer and Gladiator 2 just coming out now.
Sure.
Two sequels 25 years apart, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of interesting. Twister, especially, that was May of '96. So that was a pretty critical time in my life. I was just finishing up my master's degree and starting my PhD in the fall. So, when we talk about sort of critical periods, like it's definitely something that brings me back.
Yeah.
But the second reason, I always have taught my classes with this idea towards dystopian films.
Okay.
So like in the early or the mid 2010s, I introduced zombie films.
Mm-hmm.
In 2020, I pivoted to use Contagion.
And we talked about that on the show. I think that was your first appearance, right?
It absolutely was. Yep.
And that was the height of the pandemic.
Yep, you were still a noob at this.
Yes, exactly.
And that kind of materialized into this broader unit that I just kind of started to call the psychology of the unknown. So I've been reflecting on that a lot lately. And the question kind of came up, well, if there is a psychology of the unknown, if that's a thing, then psychology of the known is a thing. And that's where kind of nostalgia has started to kind of creep into my teaching and the role that nostalgia plays and why it is we crave it so much. And I thought that this was a good opportunity with those two, films so far apart.
Right.
Let's talk about it a little bit and see, from a psychological perspective, what is it that draws us to this, that somebody says 25 years later, let's make a sequel to it now.
Yeah. And I would say both of them, I believe, I would say are spiritual sequels and not true sequels, because all the characters are different and time periods are different, right? So Twister is ostensibly set in the mid-90s. Twister's ostensibly set in the mid-2020s, as we are now. And I believe the time between the two Gladiators, I think maybe the only connective tissue is the Paul Mescal's character Russell Crowe's son, right?
Yes. The little kid from the first one who we learn is sent away after the emperor is killed and the upheaval. So they send him away and he comes back. Gladiator 2 is tied much more into the original than Twisters was. I actually thought, the way that they did, Twisters was making it a sequel, but not really. Right. They had these really, really loose tie-ins.
I will push back on the loose aspect of the tie-ins.
Well, so I think that there was a lot of stuff that was like on the nose that was meant to evoke the imagery from the first one. But in terms of like the actual story, it wasn't like they weren't going back and referring to Joe or Bill or any of those characters as if they
nobody
ever
from
really
the original story, right? I will argue
Dorothy
does. Yes.
Yep. Dorothy 5.
I will argue that the stories are almost
Identical?
Yep. So
Yes.
there is
You won't
there
be-
is that
you won't be
aspect.
arguing.
Okay, I won't be arguing. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So I want to before we jump into the nostalgia aspect of this, because this is very fascinating, and a related idea that I've been coming across more recently is this idea of how the US used to have what is considered a monoculture, where the vast majority of the people in the country had a shared experience of, and I'm just going to pick just pop culture for now, because that's what the nature of the show is, right? So a lot of people saw Twister. It is considered one of the first first summer blockbusters, and a lot of people saw it, and a lot of people can tell you, and you remembering that you were graduating with your master's in 1996 at that time, right? A lot of people can be like, oh yeah, I remember that summer where I went and saw Twister, and you could talk to a lot of people about it. And I'm from California, and in 1996, that was my only experience of tornadoes, right?
Mine too.
So I'm like looking at these gigantic funnels in the sky created by CGI, of course, and I'm just like, wow, these are crazy. People deal with these all the time, and now I live in Tornado Alley, and at least once a year, sometimes in April, sometimes in May, generally speaking, not after that, at least for Illinois, do we have to go down into the basement because we have a tornado warning, right? A tornado watch versus a tornado warning, right? Watch is you've got the ingredients to make tacos. Tornado warning, people are having some tacos.
Yeah.
So it's quite a different experience that I've had. And then that coupled with Twisters. But going back to the monoculture idea for a second, is that we don't have a monoculture anymore, especially with pop culture. The pop culture landscape is so fractured that, yeah, a lot of people may have gone to see Twisters, and maybe a few more saw Twisters on Paramount or whatever streaming services it's on now, but most people haven't. And you go, oh, did you see Twisters? And they're like, what? Who?
Yeah.
Glenn Powell? Who's Glenn Powell? Right? And you're kind of scratching your head like, how do we have these shared experiences anymore? And I think that's gonna impact the sort of collective nostalgia that Hollywood is resting on right now, right?
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I used to back, when I first started teaching, my class was psychology and popular culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it really was this idea that American culture is popular culture,
Mm-hmm.
or popular culture is American culture, however you wanted to put it, because
Right.
of that, idea of it being a monoculture. Right. Everybody was consuming the same popular culture. We didn't have all of the options that we have today. So you had your big blockbuster movies that everybody would go see.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they came on cable, people who didn't get a chance to see it in the movies would consume it in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And, TV was ubiquitous, and everybody knew what the Friends were up to, and
Mm-hmm.
whatever, TV show was popular at the time. And now you're right. It is, it's very, very fractured in the sense that people have way too many options now in terms of where they're going to get their entertainment. And that idea of that broad popular culture being so ubiquitous is taking a little hit.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to stop Hollywood from trying.
No, and I don't think it will. I mean, I'll give you an example of the nostalgia train still hitting, Gen Z people when they were kids, like, for example, iCarly, right? There was a revival season of a series for that, right? So by no means is this only for Gen X and millennials, people of a certain people within that generational time frame, right? But I think there will come a point where Hollywood will not be able to finance spiritual successors or sequels or other legacy kinds of things. Maybe big tent franchises like Marvel, Star Wars, those will continue on probably into perpetuity. Unfortunately. But, I think Disney may have also recognized that Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny didn't do as well as it could have. But everybody looked at Harrison Ford and was like, I don't know, that's not my Indiana Jones anymore. Like, he was great in the 80s, and maybe Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is losing some of that harsh veneer that it got when it first came out, but except for the ending. But, it didn't perform, and I think maybe that told Hollywood, okay, we should probably dial back on trying to get these old geezers back into their old roles.
But then you get movies like Top Gun last summer or Barbie, right? Where you're pulling this intellectual property that really capitalizes on Gen X, and it's wildly profitable. So I think Gen X will have to completely die out, and Gen Z will have to, kind of move on for Hollywood to realize they can't recycle ideas anymore. And it's going to have to be a little bit, it's no longer just trolling the well of intellectual property. We need some original stories that talk to a different generation.
Right. And I think that will be the final nail in the coffin for what was American monoculture. I think once Hollywood gets the point, gets the picture, it will be the last bit of monoculture. And so, as a millennial myself and a Gen Xer, I assume that you are, Anthony.
Yes.
Let's talk about nostalgia in this broad sense, right? And why we're talking about Twister and Twisters. So, broadly speaking, for our listeners, how would you define nostalgia?
Well, I mean, the way that I look at it is, things are nostalgic when they prime something from your past.
Okay.
Whether it directly be a particular memory or bringing you back to a particular time, or, surrounding you with something that's familiar. Different films do it in different ways. And I think, when we get into talking a little bit about the nostalgia aspects of Twisters, I think that, one person's, criticism of the film, of it being a copycat of the original, is another person's nostalgia for the imagery and themes, from that original movie.
Sure.
So for me, and I know that nostalgia has, some different components. For me, it's a lot about that emotional comfort. It is that it takes you back to a time that was largely simpler, connected with, things from our past that we largely look at in a favorable light. And, it really becomes that kind of that warm blanket. I read somewhere, talking about things like comfort watches. Like, what do you put on when you're tired, when you are stressed, when you are, right? We have these go-tos that serve these purposes, right? Sometimes it's just because we don't have to think about it. Sometimes because it's a guilty pleasure. And I won't put you on the spot now, but I do want you to think about it. I want to know what your guilty pleasure is,
have any.
Alex. Oh, you're a liar.
Oh, no, I actually have a reason for saying I don't have any guilty pleasures. And that is because guilty assumes that I feel bad.
Okay.
about watching or consuming these things, and I don't feel bad about watching anything in my life, and so
I stand corrected. Yes, you are correct.
And this is the same kind of spiel that I give my my Psych 101 students, right? These fresh out of high school, mostly mostly fresh out of high school freshmen, and they have no idea. They probably buy into the whole thing, and I'm just like, hey guys, like what you like, watch what you watch. This isn't a guilty pleasure, because that assumes that somebody's just like wagging their finger at you, like you shouldn't be watching this. And I you're not me. I don't care. I know people like to call them guilty pleasures, so I will indulge your question.
Thank you.
So my guilty pleasure, even though I feel no ounce of badness for this, is I like to watch film breakdowns on YouTube, right?
Okay.
So and it sort of represents a rewatch for me because they're very extensive breakdowns. Trivia, behind the scenes, some philosophizing going in on it, right? But of course, what is there to gain from this other than just random trivia about movies? Would be what I think somebody would say from the outside. But to them, I'm like, all right, well, it's not your life. You don't have to watch them.
True. Yep.
What's your guilty pleasure?
Oh, I have two, and they check all the boxes for me, and it is the original Point Break and the original Roadhouse.
FBI agent.
I could watch either of them anytime it's on, and you're right.
Patrick
Unapologetically.
Swayze fan over here.
No.
I only recently watched the first Point Break, not Point Break, Roadhouse this summer, because I was like, this Jake Gyllenhaal looks pretty beefy in this one. I kind of want to check it out, but I think I should watch the first one first. Another one of those remakes, right? Not actually a sequel. I would actually, Twisters is more like a remake than a spiritual sequel, but that is neither here nor there.
Yeah, that one is. Yeah, I mean, I don't have the fondness for that sequel or reboot or whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen,
for a variety of different reasons?
Have you seen the remake of Point Break?
Yep, I don't have a fondness for that either.
Oh, it's awful. I'll just go out on a limb and say it's awful, because you don't have Keanu.
Yeah,
I think Keanu makes that movie. Of course, Patrick Swayze does too, in both cases. But no Keanu.
They were both of a time, and were exactly what they were, and they really are. They're comfortable places for me to be, and they're quotable, and I know what's going to go on, so there's not a lot of thought that goes into them.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I've had a rough day or I have had a frustrating day, I could put that on, and at least for 90 minutes,
Sure.
I kind of lose myself in that particular watch.
Right. So let's apply some of these ideas to Twister and Twisters. So what draws you on this nostalgia angle to Helen Hunt and Bill Paxton's jaunt through tornadoes?
Well, we both recently rewatched this, and I think we both have come to the conclusion that it's a film that didn't age well.
No.
Right. So when we think about that film, right, it exists in our memories in a particular way.
Right.
And, as do many memories, they're sanitized versions of our past. And, that was a moment. It was a natural disaster movie. It was a summer blockbuster. Again, it's associated with a particular time. And rewatching it almost kind of spoils it for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm able to kind of look at it and realize why it was that I'm so connected to that movie. But on a rewatch, it's really, you could see all of the warts, and obviously the CGI from 1996 is poor in comparison to today's standards.
Cow.
Yeah. But it was still for the time a fun movie, and as sanitized as my memories are of it, it served its purpose as that blockbuster in 1996. Fast forward, right, to this idea that somebody is going to make, and whatever we want to call it, right? It's not really a remake. It's not really a reboot. It's not really a sequel. It's another movie about tornadoes. That's roughly set geographically in the same place.
Yeah.
That has very, very thin plot lines that try to connect it to its past, but otherwise tries, and yes, Alex, I'm saying tries to be its own movie.
It does.
It's not.
It tries to be its own movie in Tornado Chasing 2024.
Yes. The idea that social media playing a prominent role,
absolutely,
and social media personalities, the idea, at least initially, that the villain, is going to look a little different than, Jonas did in Twister.
Yeah.
This sort of smug, corporately sponsored tornado chaser has been replaced with the renegade cowboy, not a corporate sponsor, but selling T-shirts and coffee mugs and, things with his likeness on it that are equally distasteful to the real tornado chasers.
And I want to jump in here because I think one of the things that the filmmakers did well in Twisters, which changes the nature of my nostalgia for the first one, was that, so in the first one, you're right, Jonas is this smarmy guy who has all of the fun tech and is really doing some storm chasing for the money. But the filmmakers for Twisters flipped that on its head, and Javi and his group end up being the smarmy people because they are working with local governments to snatch up property from people after tornadoes have come through, and they have all of this fancy tech where the ragtag group of essentially unemployed social media folks are the ones that become endearing, like Joe's group from the first one. So I actually like how they flip the script on that one, where the people with the fancy tech end up being the quote unquote bad guys in the movie. I mean, of course, nobody's an actual bad guy. Sure, there's some moral and ethical interpersonal dilemmas that are created by people's choices in these two movies, but nobody's really a bad guy, right? And so I like how they did that. But as far as my nostalgia goes for the first one, on the rewatch, now as a scientist, I'm like, wow, they really made the science kind of the jerk in this, right? So tech is all well and good, and science and Doppler and predicting storms and doing all of that in both movies is all well and good, but, you got to have that sense. You have to have the actual sense, the intuition to detect the storms, right? And it's all about intuition. That, I think, draws me away from the original.
Hey, what's up?
Going green.
Greenwich.
Saddle him up.
You got it, boss.
Charles, I need a sector scan on that cell. Keep looking for a hook.
We'll do, sir.
Planners, what are my dew points doing?
Points up to 70, sir.
Honey, I got you a lemon.
We gotta move out. Listen, follow us in the truck, but stay behind Dusty's van. You'll be safe back there. I gotta go with Joe. Okay, let's move out, people. Let's go.
Where are we going?
I agree with you. I think that one of the smart decisions that they made with the sequel was they made the Javi character, likable enough that when you kind of realized what his true motivations were, you felt a little disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't make Tyler hateable enough that you can kind of go with them, when when you start to realize that, yeah, okay, they're selling T-shirts, but they're also the ones that are in the aftermath of tornadoes, helping the people. So I did think it kind of, turned that on its head in a nice way. But the image, and you're right, and it's interesting because in 1996, right, science in movies, was that a thing? Like, I mean, nobody wanted to see science in movies. And I mean, I don't even know if I would have even known whether or not science was being portrayed well in 1996.
Sure,
I was barely a master's, degree. So it was like, okay, I do think that, especially in the last couple of years, science has been more out in front. I mean, people talk about it, both for good and bad. And in terms of people who, don't believe in science or deny that, science and don't understand science. Of course, that's a thing too. But I do think that people's interest in science, especially with a lot of the science, through the pandemic being so transparent or attempting to be so transparent.
Right.
So I do think that it lands a little differently in 2024, especially for us as scientists. And I still always feel weird calling myself that. But I guess we are.
Yeah.
So,
it's fair.
Looking at it in that lens, it's like, well, I mean, we use intuition, we're like, I wonder if, and I think this, and, of course, then we put it to, much more rigid standards than, we see in the movies, but they only have 2 hours. What are they going to do? Are we going to watch them write a grant for 30 minutes?
That would be compelling television.
Sure. Yeah. Writing IRBs.
Right. Exactly. And so whether or not these people, we don't really know who's got degrees in what and for what and how long or all of that kind of mumbo jumbo. We do know that Kate in Twisters works at the New York office of NOAA, I believe, or some sort of
National Weather
sister
Service
organization
or something.
Yeah, something like that. And is, doing weather predictions from a desk in front of a computer. And I think modeling is really, really important. And that's one thing that has changed between the two films, right? Modeling has gotten far better in 30-ish years for tornadoes. So let's go back to nostalgia. Let's go back to the feelings of nostalgia, right? I feel like I'm kind of taking a dump on these two movies, and I don't want to. I don't want to do that. I mean, I will go on the record and say I did not like Twisters. I was frankly bored.
Okay.
Toward the third act, and that was because I kind of knew what was happening. Like I already had the memory, right? So you write here this idea of cognitive ease. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So, one of the, things about, nostalgia is it communicates something, to the viewer in a way that we don't have to think about it a whole lot. So I think you and I have talked about like the use of things like tropes in movies, right? There are these shortcut things that, producers and directors will use because we sort of know, like we know shorthand what it means. And I think that this nostalgia plays on some of that, same cognitive strain. When you're watching Twisters, it's like you can get caught up in the visual elements of it and you're not worrying about whether or not Kate's idea of taming the storm has a whole lot of scientific merit, right? We just know that she wants to science it, right? And great, because we've moved past the modeling. Right now, we want to control it, right? And so the nostalgia and kind of this, repeating of some of the imagery and the sounds and the, all of the beats of the first movie are echoed in the second movie. It just sort of allows you to shut your brain off a little bit, even more so. And to me, that makes that connection even when I don't want it to. So like I went in there wanting to love this movie, but I just want to say I went into Top Gun last summer wanting to hate it. But for the same, but for the same reason I loved Maverick last summer, it's the reason I loved Twisters this summer. It brought me back. And it didn't matter if it wasn't really, engaging in a whole lot of, novel storytelling. I didn't care. I want to see people like practically getting sucked up into a funnel, a tornado funnel and holding on for dear life and holding out the pipes.
Right. And I would say that I felt similarly. I wanted to be thrilled as it being a thriller, a natural disaster thriller. But I think the cognitive ease aspect of this did the opposite. And I got bored. Like the movie theater scene, where this massive tornado, obviously an EF5, is ripping through this small town. And I was just thinking to myself, there is no way that these people would not have already been underground. There's no way. And so my suspension of disbelief just completely evaporated, to use another weather term. It went away and I was like, okay, yawn, nobody's going to die. Sure. This really sucks for this town. And then you learn about the whole, or prior to that, you learn about the insurance thing and the ripping off the landowners, etc. And I'm just like, oh man, my nostalgia for the first movie and its simpler tone, so much better than this more grounded, grittier remake or sequel, whatever, showing us that capitalism still sucks. Like I was just
the message hasn't changed.
Yeah. But in the first one, they don't play with that. They don't touch that at all, right? It's just two bands of storm chasers who are in it to do the best they can. Yeah, Jonas is, Cary Elwes as Jonas is kind of a jerk, but he's got a bunch of people that work for him. They're all trying to make a living, whatever. And then we've got this ragtag group of people who just freaking love weather, man. And there's some interpersonal conflict between Joe and Bill, and Melissa is there. But there's no, like, this is real life. And I think that's what just, like, knocked me over the head. And I was like, I'm out of this, guys. Which I think draws me back to Twister, and my fondness for that. As I idealize that film. Rewatching it last night, I was like, okay, I mean, cow, sure. Yeah. I was the interpersonal conflict. I was like, okay, yep, this is 90s drama. And so rewatching it, I was just like, but I still idealize it. Sure. In that nostalgic part of my memory.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, the difference between, my conversation with you, about this, and I actually was on another podcast when Twisters first came out. And, the difference between somebody who walked out of the movie theater on that day in the middle of the summer, either like giddy with excitement, in what you just saw, or disappointed to some extent. And in those conversations, the people who we were talking to, or I was talking to, many of them echoed the same things that you're talking about. Meanwhile, there was me and several others who were talking about fire tornadoes and what happens when you shoot fireworks into a tornado. And those were the things that we came out of that movie with. understanding that this movie had enough warts, on it, that it was certainly not ever going to go down as this cinematic masterpiece. But I now know what it would look like if there was a fire inside a tornado, or at least what Hollywood wants me to think.
What a filmmaker thinks would.
Yeah.
Maybe they asked an actual tornadologist.
Maybe.
Climatologist.
I don't know.
Whatever.
I don't know who their meteorological consultants were.
Right. It's safe to say that you don't want a vortex of fire, I think.
No.
At all.
And
I think
and tornadoes barreling through refineries are bad. So we've established that.
Protect the oil refineries.
Yep. And living on the Gulf Coast, with refineries all over the place, and we don't necessarily have to worry about tornadoes, but hurricanes.
Mm-hmm. The other form of circling air that is very, very dangerous.
Yeah. At least you could see those coming for quite a while.
Right.
Hey, Boone, I'm having trouble with this trigger here. What's going on? Give me the build set.
Seems quite close.
Hey, Ben, can you give me some water?
Yeah, it feels like it's a little sticky. Boone, this is all chocolate. Sorry, man. You gotta quit eating chocolate in the damn chocolate. I'm not gonna bring no chocolate. Hey, all right, we're good to go. Augers deployed.
I will say this though, that Twister will definitely remain a feature of my nostalgia, and I will think fondly of it, and that's because 1996, as you said, was a simpler time for a number of reasons, right?
Yep.
We can say that we were younger, right? There were fewer cares. You were finishing your master's degree. I was 10 years old.
You were a baby.
Yeah. So there was the internet was in its infancy. There was no social media. There were no podcasts, sadly.
Yep.
Because that was an iPod thing. There were no geopolitics. Seemed less ridiculous than they do now, right? There far less globalization. There were no smartphones or cell phones.
Yeah,
unless you were a rich person who were very important. You had a beeper, potentially. I know my parents did toward the end of the 90s, and so we think fondly back at that time, and it's entirely possible that a 10-year-old, like my son, he hasn't seen Twisters, but if there was, I saw Twister in 1996. I actually thought about showing my son Twister, but I totally forgot about it this past weekend, and it didn't end up happening. And I was like, dang it, because I think he may have expressed some interest, but here's the difference: like, he's been in the Midwest and a place where tornadoes form for the better part of his life, so it's not like it's a foreign topic to him, right? So I don't know how we would react in watching a movie about tornadoes, right?
True.
It's obviously an empirical question, but you can imagine some other child who went and saw Twisters, right? The sequel that came out this year, and thought to themselves, whoa, that was amazing. Fireworks in a tornado, fire tornado, twins. I do think that they should have said sisters, but that's me. That's the nostalgia part of my brain. It's like, sisters, far better.
Sure.
And they think to themselves, wow, this is a really good movie. And then in 20 years, they're like, I kind of want to watch Twisters again, because I was 10 when I saw it. And it might make me feel a little bit better, even though it's a natural disaster movie. You know what I mean?
No, yeah.
And that's the weird way that nostalgia works. Like, we're sitting here pining for a past that is glamorized, that is idealized, that is unrealistic to the actual day-to-day emotions that we felt. But we still pine for those days, right? The true tragedy of human memory.
And, there is something to be said, and kind of tying this all back up. Like, what originally got me thinking about this was, the last couple of years, the forays into dystopian films. And there is an element, even in those films, while it's certainly not idealized, there is a little bit of a romanticization when you're watching some of those, of like how all of the conventions of society that are, we might consider to be annoying or over the top now are kind of stripped away. And there is a little bit of like, you're watching, like the folks from The Walking Dead, and you're like, it's, except for the zombies, it seems like a pretty good, chill life. Everybody's kind of, they're focusing on human relationships and their problem solving. And it's certainly not something that people are like, man, that's what I hope. I'm really hoping that that's what it comes to. But there is that part of yearning for that simpler life that also makes dystopian films appealing in certain ways, and that's especially true for young adults. So
and we can throw in natural disasters. I mean, natural disaster movies, like those are usually pocketed to a given place at a given time, as opposed to like whole world situations like dystopian movies. But I think we can throw that in there. Like, what would you do in this situation if you were to survive this kind of natural disaster? What would come of it? And I think Joe's character and Kate's character really characterize this. And so I want to pivot to some of the psych concepts that are sort of evident in these two movies. They are very similar plots, very similar stories. So in the movie, in Twister, Joe is with her parents during a surprise, again, crazy, a surprise tornado that rushes over their house, and they have a storm cellar that is away from their house, but like apparently not kept up. This is 1969. And the dad did a very shoddy job of securing the door. I didn't remember this part, the very beginning. I remember her dad dying, but I didn't remember like the really shoddy workmanship of that door. If that's going to be your only way to survive, then can make sure that door is secure, man. Anyways, dad tries to be a hero to keep the door of the storm cellar closed. I don't think realizing that he probably would have been fine if they had just gone to the very back of the cellar, because the mom and Joe survived. But he's holding the door, and then he gets sucked out. And it's an apparently an F5. And I love it how back in the 90s, they still use just the Fujita scale. But now we have the extended or expanded Fujita scale. So now things are classified as an EF 0 through 5 tornado. And that's based on wind speed and path of destruction, I think. Something along those lines. Yeah. Damage. Yeah, right. As opposed to hurricanes, which are really only characterized by their wind speeds.
Wind speed.
Yeah. So it's an F5 tornado, or an EF5, I suppose, that kills her dad. And so she apparently wants to murder all tornadoes in a revenge plot. And so she, I guess, goes to school for meteorology. That is sort of unknown. And gathers
she has a lab.
She does have a lab. That's true. So maybe she is Dr. Joe Harding.
Yeah, they never give her a title. They do reference Muskogee State University.
Okay.
So there is a academic lab that they kind of at the end they're like, I'll run the lab. No, I'll run the lab. So it does seem to be anchored in academia.
Okay.
So presumably Dr. Joe.
Okay. So presumably Dr. Joe, who has a revenge hard-on for tornadoes, right? Wants to find the EF5 that killed her dad and figure out what makes it tick so she could kill it later. And so her and her estranged husband Bill have this ragtag group of storm chasers. This represents a good example of someone who has relatively uncommon PTSD. So somebody who is a survivor of a natural disaster, but still loses a loved one. Not the form of PTSD that you generally hear about. Not to say that it's not uncommon, but it's not the kind of PTSD that you hear like about people who are veterans of wars or other military conflicts or survivors of sexual assault and the PTSD that results from that, or even like car accidents, right? Those are pretty numerous when it comes to it.
She, the whole idea of her metaphorically wanting to bring her dad back, right? This idea that if she can model a tornado and then create some kind of early warning and save other people, again, sort of Freud would have a field day with this, right? Metaphorically save her dad.
And Bill even calls her out on that.
Bill, Joe, it's over. The thing was stable and then it's gone.
It's back building.
It's not through yet. You're right, it's back building. We got a jumper here.
Bouncer, it's back building. You gotta track it.
Yeah, Joe, we know data isn't complete. I think you guys should get out of there. You copy?
Bill, help! Bill, help me!
Joe, we should leave.
No.
Forget
Help
the
me!
sensors.
Help me!
We gotta get out of here now.
No.
Get a jump.
Bouncer will see it if it drops. If it's anywhere near us,
It's not
he'll
gonna
tell us.
drop anywhere near. It's gonna drop right on us.
No, go back!
Forget it, Joe. Forget it.
Go back! It's not too late! Go back!
Forget it.
Yep. Well, and there's also a little bit of survivor guilt, and we actually see that in both films as well. Joe and Kate are not all that different in that regard.
And down to the kinds of people that they actually are portrayed by, like little facsimiles of each other, the two actresses. Yeah, and so Kate, her PTSD stems from her survival of a large tornado that descended upon her boyfriend and their two friends. Javi is also part of this group, but he is elsewhere and not affected by the actual tornado. And they go to the place that you're not supposed to go in the tornado.
Oh, right.
And
under a bridge.
I didn't know this. I don't think this is an aspect in Twister. They do go under a bridge, but it's a small wooden bridge, not an overpass. And so I think the myth stems from the fact that there are quite a few like highway over and underpasses, right, in Tornado Alley. And so people are like, oh, I'll just go to find shelter. They actually do this in Man of Steel as well. Everyone goes underneath the overpass and then Kevin Costner as Jonathan Kent's like, no, son, I'm going to go fight the tornado myself.
Yeah.
Don't be a hero, Superman, right? Alien boy, don't be a hero. They're all underneath the underpass. And so I think people get the wrong idea about if they're out on the highway, out in the middle of rural country, and they see a tornado, like, where do I go? And they're like, oh, okay, there's a bridge. But this is like one of the worst places you can be if a tornado is descending upon, like if you are in the path of a tornado, because
in
it
Twister
will suction you.
Yeah, in Twister, right, the bridge is more along the lines of like they jump underneath the bridge, which is like flat, so they're actually like getting down below the
right.
the level of land,
I think,
as opposed to an overpass where they're not really doing anything other than
going higher.
this,
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think the size of the bridge does also matter too, right? So overpasses are these giant concrete structures. And in Twister, it's like this like walking bridge.
Yeah, it's tiny.
Almost.
Yeah.
It's like a single lane bridge or something like that. And it's wooden, so like air can pass through it too. Right? So it also is
not going to create that wind
concrete.
tunnel.
Yeah, concrete bridges, the wind has nowhere else to go except through that hole. And so Kate's boyfriend and friends get all sucked up either before they get to the bridge, or her boyfriend gets sucked up inside and Kate survives. So like you said, she has survivor guilt. Instead of developing a plan for vengeance, however, she completely dismantles her idea of stopping a tornado before it even starts and packs up and leaves Oklahoma. So she deals with her PTSD in the exact opposite way that Joe does. And I find that fascinating, for the fact that they're essentially the same character, although Kate has aspects of Joe as well as aspects of Bill from Twister. And I like how they combine the two characters, because Bill in Twister is the one who can like use his sixth sense to figure out what the weather's going to do, where Joe's just like, yeah, I'm here for the revenge. Whereas Kate is here kind of for the revenge, but then gives up, but then still has the, like, I can sense, I have this intuition about storms.
Kate is the tornado whisperer.
Yeah. Right. Bill and Kate are the tornado whisperers. And I like how they combined the aspects of those two characters into one, so they could make Tyler a completely different character for this modern era, right? Which has to help Kate with her PTSD, right? He represents the person who helps her. Now, Javi, as her old friend, gets her back into the game reluctantly, but doesn't want to help her with her PTSD, doesn't want to help her work through her grief.
No.
Sort of wants to use her grief to help him.
Her skill set is what he needs, right? I mean, the technology that he was working with that was developed when he was in the service, right? It was this, system that required to know, like, not just where the tornado went, but also where it was going. And so her skill set was necessary in order to, make that technology work on that larger scale, which, obviously, would mean all sorts of financial gains, for him over and above like what the sort of shady, dealings, in order to get his business funded.
Right.
So he needed her, and I don't know if it was as much using her grief or using her PTSD as not being aware of it, or because he makes some offhanded comments like, I was there too, they were my friends too, right? Like almost that I'm fine, you should be fine. There are a little bit of those overtures. But I mean, he definitely wanted her for that particular skill, regardless of what kind of trauma she was feeling over losing, ostensibly, all of her friends, but her boyfriend, being the big one.
Right. And somebody that it seems like they were going to get married, they were going to build a life together. So yeah. And as far as Joe is concerned, we don't know how old she is when her dad is sucked up by the tornado, but I think she's like 6 or something.
That's
I
where
want
I
to say,
put her, yeah.
Yeah, so like very tragic to lose to lose a parent that young. A different kind of trauma for both of them. Shared, sure, as a storytelling sense, but different kind, I think, and which creates different motivations for the two. And I appreciate that they did not have Kate's character lose a parent to a tornado like Joe, right? Because then it would have been very similar motivations, or we would have seen Joe take the bull by the horns like she does, right? And she's just a singular focus for many, many years, right? And we are told about her tenacity between losing her father and this point in the movie, right? Whereas if Kate had lost a parent and turned tailed and run, I think that would have made her quite a different character, quite a different characterization. And I think would have made her too close to Joe. And we would have looked at Joe and have been like, well, look at what Joe was able to do. Kate, what do you like? What's the deal, man? Does it make sense?
And both of them, it's an interesting exploration of what those traumatic experiences did for their relationships, right? So you don't necessarily see Joe and Bill's marriage like unwinding, but you certainly get the sense, through their conversations that singular focus that Joe had is the primary thing that kind of tore them apart. And you certainly see, Kate, in Kate's case, it's not the tearing apart of an intimate relationship, but almost a reticence to form those bonds. The not wanting to get connected. You kind of even see it like she's a little bit aloof or off put, like her colleagues in New York. So I don't know when you were watching it, but when I kind of got this idea of her kind of plopping herself down in the city was this way to sort of hide in plain sight. And not necessarily connect. I always think of, big cities as serving one of two purposes, right? You got those people who just want to connect with everybody.
Sure.
And the city affords that. But it also affords those places for people to just be out and hiding in plain sight without ever really having to form any of those meaningful bonds because the city sort of allows that to happen. And that's kind of how I saw Kate.
Yeah.
So impacting the relationships different ways, but certainly, the interpersonal idea of pushing away of people because not wanting to get hurt.
And just a final note on PTSD that I share with, I mean, I don't teach abnormal, so I don't get to talk about PTSD a lot, but when I mention it in Psych 101 as part of psychopathology, I like to say that, depending on when the trauma occurs in a person's life, it is going to change the way that the person goes through the rest of their life, right? So, right, we give massive props to people who survive trauma, right? It's survivor resilience is real, and it's definitely got to be celebrated. But there is a difference for a 6-year-old kid or so and losing their parent and how they forged their life after that versus Kate. In Kate's case, right, we see her 3 years after the tornado kills all of her friends, right? So she's already an adult, already doing something in either, undergraduate or doing some sort of graduate training. And so she's already an adult and she suffers this trauma and it impacts her in a completely different way to the child. And I think
Absolutely.
both movies display that aspect of resiliency in a profound and good way, right? Yeah, the characterizations of them are fairly shallow.
Yeah.
As is going to be the case in a lot of movies that feature PTSD, because unless the movie is about post-traumatic stress disorder, then you kind of have to cut corners here and there. But
yeah, you can't give a nuanced, and that's actually true of a lot of pathology. Like that's part of the problem with pathology in movies.
Yeah.
Is like it's really hard to do the nuanced approach.
Except when we talked about Born on the 4th of July. That is a great movie about PTSD because we spend a lot of time with the character based on a real person, right? And we spend a lot of time with that person, and so we can actually explore. So we do get that nuanced view of PTSD and its effects. But as far as this one is concerned, like I think they do a pretty good job of showing the differences, and it's important because otherwise the movies would be almost almost irreversibly identical, and then we would be like, okay, well, one just has better graphics than the other, right?
And
larger tornadoes, right?
The suck zone. It's the point, basically, at which the twister sucks you up. That's not that technical term for it, obviously, but...
The last thing I wanted to ask you, Anthony, is about our last topic, and that is, would you ever storm chase? Would you ever go out on a tornado chase?
It's interesting. No, so I don't think I would. At least
I like how you hummed and hawed about that. And you're like, no.
It's intriguing, right? It's a life. It's a circumstance that I'm never put into these situations where it affects my daily life. So there is a little bit of a romanticism about storm chasing. I have driven, across the country. I've driven through Tornado Alley. I have, imagined scenarios. What would I do? And all of them involve turning around and running. So no, I do not want to.
There's a tornado over there. I'm going this way.
Yep. I don't think I want to be any part of that. I'm not, I'm not an adrenaline junkie. I'm not like a thrill seeker. I'm not going to jump out of an airplane. I'm not going to do those things.
Do you go on roller coasters?
I used to. I haven't been to an amusement park in so long.
Fair enough.
I think I would still though, because it's nostalgic.
Yeah, okay.
And I might get on a roller coaster and be like, what the hell was I thinking? Like, this isn't fun anymore. But I'm certainly not, going to, to chase those experiences. I'm perfectly content with leaving those to others.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I don't think you would find me running around rural America trying to find a tornado along the windswept plains. I have no desire to do that. And I would say that the point I'm trying to make here is that both movies have a set of characters who get, a handful of lines here and there. Some of them are scientific exposition, and some of them are just like, woo, we're having so much fun. Like, let's do this. Philip Seymour Hoffman's character in Twister is the go-to example for this one because he plays, death metal on a loudspeaker from his motorhome. And then in Twisters, we got the cameraman who screams, "Twins, we've got twins," and they're all just like, oh my God, this is like amazing. And then, Tyler outfits his truck with these drills that go into the ground so they can go inside the tornado and not get sucked up. I'm just like, you will never, ever catch me doing this. But there are people out there. It is a personality trait to thrill seek or risk take.
Sure. Yeah.
Some people are far more risky than others. I would consider myself a more risk averse person.
Yeah.
And so you and I, Anthony, are characterized in both of these films by two characters that were put in to represent the audience. In the first one, we have Melissa. And in the second one, we have the British journalist, I'm blanking on his name, Ben, who is doing a story on Tyler and his live streaming of storm chasing. And in both cases, these people are fish out of water. They have no idea what's going on, which allows other characters to give the audience some exposition about what tornadoes do. I moving to the Midwest, I learned quite a bit about what meteorologists are looking for when they look at tornado, and Doppler, and specifically because Dopplers go in a counterclockwise, Doppler radars go in a counterclockwise fashion. They're looking for points where there is extreme rotation. So there's wind going the opposite direction and wind going the same direction as the Doppler, and they get different colors. And they're looking for these small little points of where those colors are coming together really, really closely. And I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. So I knew a lot of what they were saying in Twisters because I've come to know that. When I watched Twister, I definitely was Melissa. I was like, oh my gosh, what is this woman doing? And why does she keep going along with them? Would you be Melissa in this case? Or
probably.
Ben?
Here, like I said earlier, right, we're more worried about hurricanes than we are tornadoes.
Oh, yeah.
On the local weather, there, we do get occasional small tornadoes that, oftentimes will form many times that doesn't even hit the ground. A lot of times over the water, but we don't, there's nobody has basements in Texas. Nobody's worried about them necessarily, because even when they happen, they're not super, super dangerous. So I'm definitely, much more in Camp Melissa or Camp Ben, in the sense that, except that I would be asking questions, but not out of I find it to be interesting, right? Because there's this whole element of, no, I don't want to be chasing these tornadoes. But there is something about the sciencey side of it that are analyzing data that scratches an itch for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there would be the kid in a candy store version of Ben and Melissa that would be asking questions well, what's that? And what does that do? And what does that do?
Mm-hmm. From the safety of a basement office.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Definitely from the safety of someplace far, far away. But I hadn't even, I hadn't even thought about those two characters, right, until we kind of was pulling our notes for this. I didn't realize just how much dialogue, was based on these characters who were the fish out of water, and how much none of that would have made sense had those characters not been there. And I really do. Now I'm really kind of interested in where else do I see this in popular culture? Where else are directors inserting ignorant characters for the sake of explanatory exposition?
Yes.
To let the viewer know what you need to know.
Right. Because it would be odd for these characters to tell each other things that they would already know, within the logic of the movie, right? So, Philip Seymour Hoffman's character talking about the suck zone to Barry Slotnick's character, they're on the same team. They would know what the suck zone is, right? Or even Bill Paxton saying something to Helen Hunt, and you're like, they were married though. Wouldn't they know what who each each person is? This is very strange. So you do need that character even for some of the interpersonal stuff, not just the science exposition stuff, but even like the interpersonal exposition. You need that character to represent the ignorant party. And you start looking for this, Anthony, you're going to be bummed that it's going to be everywhere.
I'm kind of thinking that. Like, I'm thinking about like every movie I've ever seen about space. I think there's always that character who they have to explain the physics to, and it's usually a family member or a reporter, and I mean, yeah, I may have had a revelation here that there is a very, very important recurring character in these movies that are there to represent our interests.
Yeah, and I will say, Jan de Bont did not want a character like this in Twister, in the 96 film. But Steven Spielberg and the other executive producers were like, your audience isn't going to understand anything about tornadoes if you don't have this kind of character. And he acquiesced because, obviously they're the ones bankrolling the film.
Sure.
And, he had to insert this character so we could all understand the science of tornadoes.
Yeah. I mean, you want your audience to be at least marginally, up to speed with what is going on. You don't want to completely lose them in the science of it. And so,
right.
I mean, from a production standpoint, there's value to it.
And I will say, like, if you don't have these moments, then the time between the tornadoes, the thrilling part of these films, you are going to lose the audience they're just going to be confused. And they're going to be like, tornado. Oh, another tornado. Oh, where's the next tornado? These people are boring. Where's the next tornado?
Yeah. Yeah. They need to talk about the tornadoes in some way.
Why is Dorothy important, right? Why are these little modules important? Or why in Twisters is the mixture so important for dissipating a tornado, right? Why? I do think Ben's character is a little over the top in his ignorance in Twisters, just because he is doing a story on Tyler and his streaming crew. It seems like he didn't do his homework. And he just kind of went there and was like, hey, I want to do a story on you. And Tyler's like, sure, come for a ride. And why am I going for a ride? You'll see. What?
Hey, maybe it was, I'm not going to do any research. Like, I want to experience it. Like, I don't want to bias myself. So I'm just going to drop myself into it completely ignorant and go from there.
Oh, so you're saying instead of a fish out of water, he's the early amphibian ancestor who's like, I want to try out of water for a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not knowing exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah. Making excuses for Ben and not doing his homework.
I love it. Oh, man. It's good stuff. Well, I want to thank Dr. Anthony Zoccolillo for joining me to discuss Twister and Twisters. Hopefully in about 20 years, we'll have some nostalgia about our discussion today. What's next? What are you looking forward to next semester?
Next semester, retooling the film class.
Yes.
Always looking to challenge myself. I don't like to use the same group of movies 2 semesters in a row.
Okay.
And especially with the aforementioned AI, kind of wanting to, push that class a little bit more and see what's going on. And meanwhile, there's just a whole lot of administrative nonsense that will take up my spring. So I don't know that there's going to be anything terribly exciting coming up, but we'll soldier through.
Yeah. You'll have to share the film list you ultimately decide with us, so we can get out to the audience. Because
sure, yeah, I will definitely
love that. Because I imagine there will be some films on there that have not made it yet onto the podcast. So exactly.
Then yeah,
so
I will send.
Share that with us. That'd be great.
I will. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks again, Anthony. I really enjoyed our conversation.
It's always a pleasure, Alex. You know where I am. If you ever want to have a spirited discussion about film, hey, very much enjoy.
Excellent. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Until the next one, thanks for listening.